Esteemed listener, just a quick message before we get going this week. Christmas is a-comin', and you can get the Week magazine delivered to someone you love or vaguely care about for a saving of up to 43% off the cover price. You can do this very simply by using the code PODXMAS, PODXMAS, at checkout when you subscribe. So give someone the gift of the week every week. Visit dennismags.co.uk/theweek and enter the code PODXMAS. And now on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday, the 1st of December, and this is The Week Unwrapped, brought to you by Barclays Corporate Banking. In the past 7 days, we've seen Ukraine warning of a full-scale war, with Russia, a British academic, pardoned after being accused of spying by United Arab Emirates, and Volkswagen forced to recall 75,000 cars with seatbelt flaws. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team are Rebecca Gilley, Kari Wilkin, and Jamie Timpson. And starting the show this week is Kari. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Could DNA testing prove terminal for patient confidentiality?
HD is a rare neurological genetic disease. And the worst part about it is that there is no cure. I have a 50-50 chance of inheriting this disease and ending up one day just like my mom. A simple flip of a coin. I just didn't know what side it was going to be because I had not been tested yet, like most people and families who carry a fatal genetic disease.
That was rare disease campaigner Seth Rotberg speaking at a TEDx talk earlier this year. To see the full talk, you can go to TED.com. Kari, why have you brought this to the table?
Okay, so Rotberg, he's got Huntington's disease, which is an inherited disorder that basically kills off the nerve cells in the brain. It's fatal in almost every case. Most people will die within 10 to 20 years of the first symptoms appearing. And if one of your parents have it, you have a 50% chance of having it. And you can only find out through DNA testing. And this has come up because there's a case has been launched against a hospital in South London by a woman who is suing doctors for negligence because they failed to tell her that her father had been diagnosed with Huntington's disease, HD, before she had her own child. And she then later learned that she does carry the gene. And she says if she'd known, she would have aborted her daughter, who's now 8 and obviously also has a 50% chance of inheriting this terrible disease.
But this sounds like a pretty extreme case. I mean, most people do tell their own children, don't they?
I don't think they necessarily do. And it's not just about children. There are so many, we're constantly learning more about the genetic components of medical conditions like cancer, dementia. So doctors are facing increasing pressure to consider not just the patient's needs, but also those of relatives who may share these affected genes. It raises questions of should doctors be able to break confidentiality to tell the relatives, other people who may be affected? I mean, effectively, the definition of patient is changing. It's not just the person who's directly providing the sample anymore. It's also those who are affected by the findings from the sample. So this could have major implications. It could trigger major changes to rules governing patient confidentiality. And it also just raises so many ethical questions. For example, maybe relatives don't want to know to have that death sentence hanging over their head.
This case that's being considered now is actually kind of a relaunch of the case because the first time it was turned away by the court, who said that it put unfair pressure on doctors because then they would have to make that kind of judgment call about whether they should override the patient's wishes. So they said that it's just making doctors responsible. It kind of, it's a bit of a throwback to the days when, say in the 1950s, when it was common for doctors not to tell people if they had fatal illnesses. It was really all in the hands of the doctors and their own subjective judgment.
Yeah, but this isn't about telling the person who's affected whether or not he has a terminal illness. This is about whether or not you tell effectively the grandchild of that person by telling the mother when they're an unborn fetus. I mean, that seems like a stretch of the doctor's responsibility. I suppose the nature of my first question, don't most people tell their own children, is why is this the doctor's responsibility? Surely it was his responsibility to tell his daughter that he has Huntington's disease.
It seems a bit of a stretch in terms of suing the doctor for what is clearly, for whatever reason, in this particular case, it appears that her father was told late on in life while she was still alive. And that's a question for your parent daughter relationship, really, and it shouldn't really, in my opinion, be bringing in the doctors on the outside.
But there may be cases where the patient isn't in any condition to pass on that information. You know, Huntington's disease destroys your mind, and if you're diagnosed quite late, you may not be in a position to make that rational kind of decision. And also GP guidelines, they were updated last year, so now doctors, they can disclose information without the patient's explicit consent if the patient, as I said, is lacking the capacity to give consent, if it's required by law, if it's ordered by a court, and I think this is the key point, or if it's justifiable in the public interest. So you have to then ask, what constitutes the public interest? How far does that reach?
Well, let's answer that. This seems like a family issue to me. Does it constitute the public interest whether or not one particular man had Huntington's disease? It's relevant to his family.
Because, it goes beyond a family issue. It starts to affect bodily autonomy, because the woman in the case clearly feels like she was almost, if you like, tricked into carrying her pregnancy to term, which she wouldn't have done if she'd had that important information about her own health.
And this woman's a medical professional. She hasn't been named, but that was emphasised. So she knows what she's talking about. She knows what this disease does.
I think it also has quite big ramifications if we broaden it out a little bit into things like insurance. At some point, if the doctors feel like there's a public interest, i.e. maybe possibly to insurers, for them to know about genetic testing. You know, there was an insurance expert talking about this case in particular and saying that if she wins and the doctors are seen to be liable, it'll probably change insurance as we know it, because there will then eventually be two people who are acceptable to be insured and people who aren't. And that means that then we've got a kind of undercurrent or underclass in society that are no longer insurable because of their genetic health.
And
although Huntington's is already something that insurance companies do look for, isn't it? It's the only thing actually that
this
they
is
look
actually
for.
I've got a friend whose father died from Huntington's, and she and her brother, they had to decide whether they were going to be tested. And obviously these are all factors. You can sort of say, I don't know, but if you know you've got Huntington's, you've then got to declare that on all your life insurance. You know, these are things you don't think about, let alone having this death sentence over
on
your
that
head.
though, shouldn't this woman, if she was that concerned as a medical professional with the chance that her child might have Huntington's, have just got herself checked out?
She didn't know it ran in the family, and from what I understand, she had no idea this was, because it can
well,
be
to
missed if
rephrase
someone...
then, rather than suing the doctors, shouldn't she be campaigning for a genetic scan for Huntington's to be part of the various different things that are offered to all pregnant women, like, you know, scans for Down syndrome or scans for your own genes, and whether your partner's of the same close ethnic background or whatever.
Where do you stop? Where do you stop scanning? I mean, Huntington's affects an estimated 10,000 people in the UK. Obviously, that's a considerable chunk. But in terms of the overall population, what, you're going to test for everything just in case it's hidden there? That it would be astronomical, the cost and the work involved in doing that.
Right, so that returns to my original question. Shouldn't we just assume that most people will tell their kids? And this is just an unfortunate case.
Yeah,
it's
this
a rare
is
case.
obviously an outlier, but I think this woman obviously feels that she's been allowed to fall through the cracks precisely because, you know, it is a rare situation. I think the vast majority of people would pass on that information. And her father reportedly said that he deliberately chose not to tell her despite the urging of doctors because she was pregnant, and he thought that she would terminate the pregnancy if she found out, which she would have. So obviously
we
this
should say
is
as well, the particular background of this man is quite interesting, isn't it? Not much was given to it in the press coverage, but he'd killed his own wife with a
and
shotgun.
he was actually diagnosed 2 years after doing that. And in fact, I mean, this is just pure supposition, but apparently aggression can be an early form of HD. So it's possible his illness, I mean, who knows, this is all entirely supposition, but it's possible his illness was partly to blame for that. So you can understand why his daughter is therefore having such a strong reaction.
Probably
to him not
stronger
having
perhaps
told
than
her.
other people who are affected by the tragic news, but nonetheless.
But clearly the fact that the Court of
news.
Appeal decided that this case can go ahead, it's going to trial next November, clearly they feel that the doctor's duties, although it's, you know, it's sort of vaguely covered within the guidelines, that because, you know, genetic testing is making such huge leaps forward, that maybe this is something that needs to be enshrined in law, because at the moment, you know, you can have so many cases of like these where people are going to sue various people for not telling them. Maybe there does need to be clear guidance in terms of, is anyone responsible?
I think people are quite afraid of changing the law at this moment in time because we are unsure about how, as a society, really, how far we want to go with things like genetic testing and genetic editing. And the problem is that I think from a lot of campaigners' ideas is that as soon as you change the law, it suddenly becomes acceptable. You know, things like, just last week with the babies in China that have been created, genetically edited babies. We are at a cusp of deciding, I think, as a society, whether or not we accept genetic editing as something that will exist, and maybe things like this are the cases that will turn public opinion one way or the other.
Yeah.
If the consequence of this is that she wins, and therefore patient confidentiality rules change, and if you find out as a doctor that your patient has Huntington's disease, then you owe it to their future children and grandchildren to tell them to declare it. What effect is that going to have on everybody's relationship with the healthcare industry?
Well, I mean, that's going to open up a whole new can of worms in terms of, so how does this information get passed along? You know, doctors are under immense pressure. They don't have time to play detective. You know, they could be sued if they're deemed not to have tried hard enough. If they just say, well, like Google searched this person's name, couldn't find them. But, you know, doctors are not detectives. That's not what they signed up for. So it would be a case of then deciding how this information is passed, whether there are panels that, you know, if there's hereditary conditions that are detected, do the doctors then automatically pass it to a panel to deal with this, or how it's going to be done?
And it's data that you can't protect. You know, you create all of this data, and we only have to see what happened last year with the ransomware attack, you know, and it turned out that most of the computers in hospitals were running Windows 95, creating this extra data that is really intrinsic to people's identity and quite personal.
That's like the guy in the TED Talk, Seth Rothberg. He actually didn't tell his family for 2 years because he didn't want to be just, as he puts it, HD Seth. He didn't want that to become his identity, and he said that in retrospect he regretted that, but obviously at the time that was the right decision for him. Some people don't want to just be, or they fear being defined by their illness.
Do you feel, I mean, this is a completely personal question, but do you feel you're conning someone if you know you have Huntington's disease and you end up in a relationship and you end up having children, you don't pass that information on?
To be honest, I wonder if the genetic component is a bit of a kind of red herring, because I think that gets everybody starting to feel a bit suspicious about, you know, control over your genes and, you know, dystopian future kind of scenarios. But there are already instances where confidentiality can be breached if someone's in danger, for instance, like someone's in physical danger or danger of harming themselves or someone else. So I don't think it would necessarily be too revolutionary to tweak the rules to reflect advances that have been made in genetics. So
exactly, you could argue that not passing on the information is effectively harming someone.
And there are cases, you know, there have been cases of people with HIV and AIDS not passing on that information to partners or deliberately having...
Yeah, so how do you feel about that?
Yeah.
So take the genes thing out of it. How do you feel about, if you knew you had a terminal illness, is it your responsibility to tell, even take children out of it, is it your responsibility to tell a future partner that that's the case?
From my personal perspective, I would say that the decision still needs to be in the hands of the person. But I can certainly see an argument that says that for the good of society, we need to find a way for maybe that information being passed on without it being put into people who are completely fallible and you know, can be malevolent and evil and all of those things.
I mean, it's kind of humdrum for the solution to this to be better IT. But I do wonder, you know, if the argument for sort of not putting it down on record is simply that there have been hacking attacks before and who knows who gets the information, you know, maybe actually in the future, in 20 or 30 years' time, once we've worked all this stuff out, we have properly secure electronic records and it's only your loved ones and your relatives, your blood relatives, that get this information. Maybe that's the obvious solution. It's just that at the moment it's too open to problems.
But there's also the reversal factor of maybe people don't want to know. You know, maybe it's just the fact that you may know that certain diseases, such as cancer, run within your family. Maybe, you know, we're all going to die, but knowing when can just be a huge added weight.
But then similarly, you know, as we've seen genetic advances in things like cancer diagnosis, you've seen increasing numbers of, for instance, women having voluntary mastectomies who don't have any signs of cancer because there's a high probability genetically they'll develop it. So I think that certainly at least a minority of people are definitely leaning into that idea that the more we know about our genetic makeup, that, you know, the more control we have over our decisions.
Okay, final point on this. Suing the NHS. How do we feel about that as a concept? This isn't, you know, suing a Harley Street doctor who got a lot of money for this diagnosis. This is suing the NHS, which we all pay for.
The thing is, it's easy to demonise people who take that step, but at the same time, it's such a huge institution that it really is the only way to get your case noticed.
You've got to have the ability for recourse. It doesn't matter that obviously we all love the NHS till we die. But you need to have a way for people to complain and to get, you know, to ensure that it's an efficient system.
And suing doesn't necessarily have to mean huge amounts of compensation. It can mean, I think, from what I understand in this, as this woman wants, legal change. She's not after money.
Okay, Rebecca, you're up next. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
When it comes to wartime reparations, where does the buck stop?
They started with the Jewish garment workers, Yes, there were deportations already going on, yes.
Did this
quite
affect
regularly.
your friends?
This affected, yes, I had a boyfriend at the time, and yes, it affected him. He came to say hello and say, well, he said it doesn't matter because that was the wrong notion that the people had. They were just going to Germany to work there. And because a lot of people or couples who were engaged got married just to stay together because they thought they would make a life there and just be only working there because nobody knew what was going on.
That was Helena Bromit, a Holocaust survivor, in an interview for the Montreal Holocaust Museum. Rebecca, what's the story?
So the story this week is that the Netherlands State Railway, NS, has agreed to pay compensation to Holocaust victims who were transported on its services during World War II. The Dutch national rail system was commissioned by the Nazi German occupiers to transport people who'd been rounded up in raids to Westerbork, which was a transit camp in the Netherlands. And from there, about 90,000 Jews were then sent on to extermination and concentration camps. The majority of them were sent to Auschwitz.
Why now, 70 years later?
It was actually being brought about by a public campaign by a Dutch Holocaust survivor who then went on to be a physical therapist for Ajax for a number of years. So he does have a bit of a public profile.
Yeah, and this is Salo Muller.
Salo Muller, yeah. When he was growing up, he was dropped off at kindergarten by his mother, and then his mother and father were picked up in a raid and deported, and both of them were killed. And so he has said that basically the national rail system does have responsibility because they voluntarily accepted this contract from Nazi Germany, and they were paid the equivalent of about £2 million in today's money.
Well, did they, though? Because the argument that the French rail company SNCF made when reparations were demanded from them a decade or so ago was, legally, they said this in court, we had no choice. We had the Nazis putting a gun to our head. We were in an occupied country. We're the national rail, and they're asking us to transport people.
But they accepted the money.
But is it Rebecca just used the words voluntarily.
Yeah.
I mean,
well,
you could question, couldn't you, when the Nazis invade your country and take over your infrastructure, are you voluntarily doing anything?
The slight difference with the SNCF case was that SNCF in 2014 did agree to pay towards it. There was a $60 million payout that was agreed, but they didn't actually accept responsibility. They agreed to the payout, but they said because they were ordered by the Vichy French government to carry out this work, that they shouldn't be considered responsible. Whereas in the Netherlands, it was slightly different because basically, it reminds me slightly of the cases with the concentration camps guards where they say, well, I had no choice, but then they didn't try to see what would happen if they did resist. It was kind of a similar case here with NS, the Dutch national rail carrier, because it's not like they had a gun to their heads in the sense that they were approached by the German government who said, can you do this? This is how much we'll pay you. And they said, yes.
You could argue that there are ways to resist, and they didn't.
Yeah, absolutely. They did a terrifyingly good job at transporting all of these Dutch Jews and also Jews from other countries
even on
who
that
sought
point,
refuge.
I don't know if everyone involved in NS knew what happened to the people that got to Westerbork. I mean, that presumably would be an argument they could make if they were to take this to court. They seem to be accepting, yes, we should pay out. But presumably not everyone involved in the transport of these people knew they were going to their death.
Yeah, but I mean that's an argument that we've seen like a lot around different conversations about both about reparations and about criminal responsibility for people who participated in the Holocaust. And it's interesting because it's one of those things I think where I certainly thought before I sort of read into this story that surely this isn't really an issue that's going to have ramifications very far into the future because the majority of Holocaust survivors are now in their late 80s, 90s, even older. But actually most of the recent reparations, including there was another reparation story this week, which is that a South Korean court ruled that Mitsubishi will have to pay compensation to South Koreans who were forced to work for Mitsubishi during the war, during the Japanese occupation, is that a lot of these recent agreements stipulate that the payment should go to surviving relatives if the person themselves has died. So actually this could have ramifications going for decades into the future, really. Okay,
what other companies might we be looking at then? If this goes to the state rail companies, who else were involved with helping the Nazis?
Well, Swiss banks have taken a lot of flack for their part in it. In I think about the late 90s, two of Switzerland's biggest banks agreed to repay $1.25 billion in compensation for wartime losses for two Jews, whose money was effectively confiscated, whose belongings were confiscated. So obviously there are a lot of financial institutions that are perhaps feeling very nervous at this latest ruling. And railway operators across Europe were involved in the deportation of Jews. This could spread so far.
I think there's also broadening it out from Nazis to kind of reparations more widely. I feel like there's a sea change in opinion about the role of colonial powers, maybe also things like, thinking of the UK specifically. They're called CARICOM, but it's the Caribbean Community Reparations Commission, who had a 10-point plan for how they were going to get reparations back from Europe for the slave trade. And a lot of it is about giving money to, as you said, relatives, but also investing in Caribbean cultural institutions and things. And I feel like there is a sea change certainly in this country and kind of across Europe, of actually looking to the past and saying we can no longer kind of turn a blind eye to our role in all of these bad things. And actually, we do need to start paying. I mean, the UK government have refused to get on board with it so far, but there has been a push by particularly some smaller regional governments to actually look at how we can give reparations for the things that we did, yes, 150, 200 years ago, but actually really make a difference, because we did mess things up.
But crucially, this isn't about governments. I mean, I know they're the state railway, but this is actually sort of about brands, isn't it? That's what I find interesting about this, is, this is like, you could see the whole conversation about Hugo Boss designing the Nazi jackboots and all the rest of it. Yeah, there are existing brands now that are $1 million concerns that are still trading on literally the same name. And in our society as it is at the moment, people are less affiliated to their governments. They have very strong associations with brands. We're told that brands have identity on social media and all the rest of it. That's the thing, isn't it? You're suing this continuous name.
I think your point about them not really knowing what was going to happen to the Jews when they got to that transit camp. It's not great PR for the Netherlands National Railway now to say, oh, well, from their perspective, maybe it's better to pay and just be like, look, we're one of the first companies, or one of the first, train companies that are really looking back and trying to do something about yes, they are thinking about their public image and they are thinking about their brands, and maybe in the next 10 years we'll see more and more brands, actually, it's horrible, but taking on their history and trying to make it into something that they can package.
But in a way, how ridiculous is that? No one thinks of Volkswagen as the German national car brand anymore, do they?
No, but I definitely think there has been a kind of cultural shift, whereas I think in the past the companies would have wanted to bury links like this. Now I think, as Jamie was saying, it is a bit of a kind of callous way of looking at it, but they are definitely seeing the potential positive PR that comes from embracing that history and trying to make up for it in some kind of public fashion. And I think a lot of it has to do with how, the concept of privilege has become a mainstream one, even though there's been quite, a vocal backlash to the whole concept. And, lots of people mock the concept of, white privilege or, straight privilege, all these things. But I do think it has become normalised, and people are more receptive to the idea that things that happened 50, 100, 200 years ago do continue to have ramifications in the present day.
And should you be thinking, if you are a company assisting any government now, not that there's necessarily ethnic cleansing on the scale that's happening in the Holocaust, of course, but if you're assisting in something that is politically sensitive, for example, the deportation now of people who fall foul of our hostile environment policy, should you be doing that on the basis that, in 60 years, the political situations change and reparations are demanded from you?
People aren't going to look back at G4S in a good way, are they? People aren't going to say...
now in a good way.
But that's what I mean. But in 60 years' time, who's to say what G4S actually looks like as a company? But it's going to be hard for them to do a good advertising campaign when there's so many examples of G4S security guards, being involved in the deportation and actually in kind of quite aggressive...
Same with BAE as well.
Yeah.
But I think I think people are, obviously the difference that there is, the relative transparency in things like that are going on now. Obviously, during the Second World War, people weren't really in a position to be protesting the use of Dutch National Rail in the Holocaust. But I think now people are very switched on and aware of what brands are up to and vocal about opposing that.
And hopefully if there are repercussions, for things that companies have done in the past, it might make them stop and consider if they do it now. Because, you might get away from it now, but 10 years down the line, you could be facing a huge bill for what you've done. So hopefully it will encourage more accountability by companies.
Jamie, you are our last contestant this week. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
This was the week that the UK finally called last orders.
The pub is one of Britain's cultural icons like the Queen and Big Ben, but these drinking houses have been in decline for many years. So why is this happening, and are there any solutions? In the last 35 years, a quarter of the pubs in the UK have disappeared. In London, 32 of the city's 33 districts have less bars and pubs than they did at the turn of the millennium. Hackney was the only one which saw an increase.
There was a CNBC report into why British pubs are disappearing. Jamie, I'm appreciative of some levity after Huntington's disease and the Holocaust, but I do wonder why you brought this story to the table. It's not new.
It's sad.
No, but it's not new.
This week, Office of National Statistics announced that more than 11,000 pubs have closed in the UK over the last 10 years.
Okay, so there are some new facts that tell us what we already knew.
Yes, a fall of 23%. And it was also this week an article in The Guardian that linked the decline of pubs to the decline of sex, which actually was kind of weird, but also not hugely apparent that there is a decline of sex. You know, there's just a feeling that, you know, younger people are having less sex, they're drinking less, they're doing less drugs, they're generally being much more upstanding citizens than the people that have gone before them.
Well, that's an interesting statement, isn't it? That having less sex makes you more of an upstanding citizen.
Yeah.
What implied bias? That's curious.
It's a stiff upper lip.
Glad something's stiff.
So I think there's a kind of a good discussion to be had. So it has been written up as a particularly bad thing, basically, you know, that these pubs are closing and that we're losing out on something that was traditionally a very kind of important part of the UK's national identity. And now actually, you know, a lot of the people, I mean, there was an IEA report recently that attributed it to the smoking ban and said that when we introduced the smoking ban, basically people just turned away from pubs and decided to drink at home. But I think really the question that I would like to ask the group is actually whether or not it is such a negative thing that we no longer go to pubs or that pubs exist anymore.
Great. Kari, is it such a negative thing we no longer go to pubs and that they don't exist anymore?
I think the figures are misleading, actually. I mean, even though, obviously, as the figures showed, the total number of pubs in the UK has declined quite considerably, there's actually been an increase in the number of larger pubs. So it's slightly misleading in that, yes, the number of small independent pubs is down, you know, from, I think it's about 38,000 to 22,000 since 2001. But larger ones run by chains, the actual number has increased by a couple of thousand. And if I think you kind of get the sense of maybe the floor space of pubs hasn't shrunk, in the sense that the number of people employed in the industry is about 450,000 today, which is about the same as in 2001. So I think maybe that's slightly misleading. I think maybe it's just part of the global trend that, you know, the small independent retailers, pubs, whatever, are being swallowed up by the chains who are focusing more on food, more on families.
Yeah,
and
I think a lot of the doom-mongering is predicated on this prejudice that chain pubs aren't real pubs. Chain pubs like Wetherspoon, Slug and Lettuce, you know, all of the different chains.
Lloyd's.
In many communities, they are community hubs, just in the way that independently owned pubs are. That, you know, you see this. Obviously, there are.
No, they're
ones-
not.
They're
not. They're not. They're full of
bias.
alcoholics having breakfast, aren't they? Which is
Who
fine.
do you think was propping up those old village pubs? It was the same crowd of alcohol-dependent people
I
in the
think
days when they didn't call them alcoholics.
mostly
point you-
alcohol-dependent men, at least. Now it's kind of, you could argue that this shift is actually going to, in the long run, will help pubs survive, because you've got younger people
Yeah.
growing up and going
But
for
you just
lunch
made
at
a
pubs.
point, didn't you, when you mentioned the village pub versus
Yes.
these bigger pubs. The bigger pubs tend to be in town centres.
Mm.
The village pubs are the ones that are closing down. And when people are upset about it, really, apart from a few historic buildings in London that just because the property values have gone so high have ended
Mm.
up becoming residential, really the ones they're upset about are those village pubs. And it's because they're a community hub, isn't it? That's the point.
Yes, it is. But I think that I would say good pubs do still stay open, and that there was definitely a huge surplus of crappy pubs around, you know, so there are pubs that we could probably have afforded to lose. And secondly, I think the debate gets really muddled because people start saying, oh, it's young people aren't drinking anymore, or like I've seen lots of commentary where there's like a sort of subconscious thing being like, young people are Muslims now, and you know what, where they don't go. But, you know, the village pubs are exactly the ones that wouldn't be affected by, you know, hipster millennials stopping drinking for all of January and all of this kind of thing.
I think there's a class dimension, though, isn't there? I feel like that a lot of the working class hubs have gone. You know, when was the last time you went in or saw a snooker hall? Like, when was the last time that places that used to be part of a high street that were dedicated to working class have closed down? And it is also, you know, the price differential between supermarket pricing of booze. If you can then go and buy a 6-pack of Foster's for basically the same price, roughly, that you would get for a pint and a half, 2 pints in the pub, and then take it home where you're allowed to smoke in your living room, or you're allowed to, you know, stay up as late as you want, or anything like that, it seems to me that there has been a shift from, whether it's through legislation or whether it's through just general who you appeal to, away from the working class and more towards the middle class.
Yeah, that and the fact that this, which also has a class dimension, is that there are a lot more places where you can drink now, aside from a traditional pub. People going out for boozy brunches, cocktails, wine bars, etc. But again, as Jamie was saying, there is a class dimension to that because a lot of that is also price restricted.
And, Corey, there are social places that don't involve alcohol at all. And if we take Rebecca's dismissive comment about millennials and Muslims, actually, you know, Starbucks is sort of the answer to that, isn't it, in town centres? Those are places where, regardless of your religion, regardless as well of your gender, you know, it's a place where women tend to feel more welcomed as well. That's a place where people have been going, isn't it? Coffee shops.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other argument. You know, young people are drinking a lot less now. You know, I guess it's their form of rebelling against the older generation who's sort of, you know, constantly boasting about their drinking exploits. But as long as there are alternative places to socialise, at least I suppose you could argue on the other sense that at least you haven't got these macho, you know, laddie culture of your Friday night at the pub things. You know, there are alternatives now and you don't have to sort of try and be a part of that. It's much more inclusive.
Lots of social studies, you know, that said that in the 1970s, the majority of women weren't wanting to go to the pub. You know, didn't enjoy. You know, I think there's an element of rose-tinted nostalgia about the pub in the past that wasn't
a major amount of nostalgia in all this,
and it wasn't an acceptable place for the majority of people. And you know, if we do want to be in a more inclusive society, if we do want to appeal to lots of different areas, but I guess my point would be that you could still have those small independent pubs that appeal to the working classes that weren't taken over by gentrification, and still have places like Wetherspoons and or you know, bigger chain pubs or any kind of Starbucks. You can have both.
How much of this conversation is informed by the fact that we're in London at the moment as well, I wonder? Because one of the other shows I present is called Forethought for Radio 4, and we go around the country doing that. And I went, for example, recently to Liverpool, and when you're in Liverpool and you walk down the high street, it is noticeable in comparison to London how many pubs there still are. I mean, literally every third or fourth shop is still a pub or a bar. They have a massive pub culture there. And maybe it's just the case that, you know, we get these articles written about it from a southeast perspective where people have more money, they're going out to eat. But actually around the rest of the country, there's still loads of pubs.
Yeah, but I think they do tend to be clustered in town and city centres. And so I think that makes the loss of those pubs in, you know, more rural areas, that is especially difficult for communities, especially, you know, older people or people who don't have transportation. You know, it can feel very isolating and lonely if the only pub in your village closes down. You know, you don't want to travel 5 or 10 miles into the nearest town.
But was it not the case with these figures that most of the closures of the pubs are in big cities, that in rural communities it's not being hit as hard?
And you are seeing lots of community-owned pubs now, you know, where people are recognising the community value of having a pub.
I think going back to the class factor, I think money, you know, the tax rises and the wage increases that have hit pubs, you know, maybe they need to introduce tax breaks, whatever, for smaller pubs. You know, that might be a way around it.
And that applies as well to, regardless of sort of class, I guess, how much money you have in the bank, doesn't it? If you're your classic kind of retired old man going to the pub with your dog on a Sunday to read the Sunday Times, your pint's now £5.50 and your Sunday Times is now about £4 as well, isn't it? Yeah. That's a tenner before you've done anything.
I was talking to one of our team, and he was saying his brother runs a pub, and he was saying that actually quite a lot of the issues were down to, as well as obviously the things we've talked about, smoking ban and things like that, were down to the breweries. They're taking over of pubs and basically wanting to make as much money as possible and not really caring about the clientele or about the how much. And he was saying that, you know, working for you know, his brother had worked for a brewery in the past, and all they cared about was how much their profit was, rather than, you know, things like the campaign for real ale pubs and things like that that are really prioritising a sense of feeling and those kind of things and social, you know.
Although the report that this story is pegged to shows no connection, does it? That's something that publicans say that there isn't statistical evidence for. For
the connection between...
The pub co's being the reason why the pubs are closing down.
Yeah. And I think there is probably a feeling of, you know, that example was just anecdotal, but, you know, if you are someone with a kind of a feeling of the good old days, pubcos aren't great. So they're going to be the ones that shout loudest.
Finally, if I was to take you all to the pub right now, which of course we would do, it's midday, what would be your order, Rebecca?
Now with the winter coming in, I'm quite partial to whiskey and ginger ale.
You see, you strike me as a mulled gin kind of lady if it was on offer.
I'll drink anything mulled, that is true also.
She'll drink anything.
Kari, what's your traditional pub order?
Probably a bottle of beer.
Bottle, interesting.
I like it. It tastes better out of a bottle.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, you see, you can buy that in the supermarket.
Like cool.
Jamie, Foster's and a packet of Quavers, I'm guessing.
Yeah, although I don't really like Quavers, more of a Wotsits man.
Okay, I like all the ales that are named after the war. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Rebecca Gilley, Kari Wilkin and Jamie Timpson, and also to our sponsor, Barclays Corporate Banking. Their industry experts can help your business. Find out more at barclayscorporate.com/theweek. Now, you will never miss an episode if you subscribe to this podcast. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your app of choice and hit subscribe. And don't forget our miraculous Christmas offer. Use PodXmas at the checkout for 43% off the shop price to a subscription of the magazine. It's at dennismags.co.uk/theweek. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Chika Ayres at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, cheers.